Alright, welcome back to Mr. Berry Lectures. This is Chapter 16, World War II, Section 2, Japan's Pacific Campaign. This lecture was originally given on May 13th, 2015. Main idea for today's notes: empire building. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and brought the United States into World War II. Now, that's really important, and why it matters now is that World War II establishes the United States as a leading player and power in the international affairs of the world. In fact, we are now probably basically because of World War II and everything that happened after it, of course, basically the preeminent world power that still exists. Now the USSR is no longer around and has not been around for 20 years now. So we are pretty much the most powerful country in the world on a lot of different levels. Alright, setting the stage. Like Hitler, the Japanese military leaders had dreams of empire. You know, they want to pick up some land, and they're going to do it in a sort of a different manner than Hitler, but they want to build an empire of their own as well. Now, Japan had begun its expansion, as you'll recall from the previous chapters, in 1931. They took Manchuria, and then 6 years later began a full-on invasion of China in 1937. So again, fighting the nationalists and the communists there, as you remember. Now, this war, however, was a great drain on the Japanese economy. They had kind of expected a quick victory, and Chinese resistance causes the war to drag on a great deal, and therefore again put strain on Japan's economy. To increase their resources and increase their earnings from this area of the world, the Japanese leaders looked toward the rich European colonies of Southeast Asia, and also the American ones, I should point out. Now, here we go. Surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. By October 1940, Americans had cracked one of the codes that the Japanese used in sending secret messages. Therefore, they were well aware of Japanese plans for Southeast Asia. They kind of knew what was going on. Now, if Japan conquered European colonies there, it could also threaten American-controlled Philippine Islands, as well as Guam and Wake Island and various other places. Now, to stop the Japanese advance, the U.S. government sent aid to strengthen Chinese resistance, and when the Japanese eventually overran French Indochina, otherwise known as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos in July 1941, Roosevelt, FDR, cut off oil shipments to Japan. Now, despite an oil shortage, the Japanese continued their conquest. They hoped to catch the European colonial powers and the United States by surprise, so they planned massive attacks on British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia and on American outposts in the Pacific at the same time. Now, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japan's greatest naval strategist, also called for an attack on the U.S. fleet in Hawaii. He said that that fleet was, quote-unquote, a dagger pointed at Japan's throat, and that it must be destroyed, and he will do that by surprise. Now, before we get into the actual attack, just keep in mind here that Isoroku Yamamoto is one of your vocab terms. He is seen here in a photo and defined as the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined naval fleet in World War II, as well as the mastermind behind the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. Right. A date which will live in infamy. Quoted, by the way, by FDR, which we will see on the next slide, but here we go. So, early in the morning of December 7th, 1941, American sailors at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii awoke to the roar of explosives. A Japanese attack was underway. U.S. military leaders had known from a coded message that an attack might come, but they did not know when or where or how it would occur. But within 2 hours, the Japanese had sunk or damaged 19 ships, including 8 battleships moored in Pearl Harbor. Now, more than 2,300 Americans were killed during this period, with over 1,100 also wounded. News of the attack stunned the American people, much like, for example, more recently 9/11 did for us. So, if you can imagine your grandparents having a reaction to this very similar to 9/11, if some of you even remember that, a lot of my students are far too young, honestly, to remember 9/11. But ask your parents about that. That they remember 9/11. Their grandparents probably remember Pearl Harbor. It is a very similar kind of shock. Now, the next day after this, December 8th, President Roosevelt addressed Congress on December 7th, 1941. He declared that this date was a date which will live in infamy, hence the title of this slide. Congress quickly accepted his request for a declaration of war on Japan and its allies. I will now show you, by the way, a video on his declaration of war. Before we do that, however, keep in mind, again, Pearl Harbor is also one of your vocab terms. It is a U.S. naval base in Hawaii, which was attacked by the Japanese Navy and Air Force on December 7th, 1941. Okay, so here comes Roosevelt's reaction to the attack.
Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Indeed, 1 hour after Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in the American island of Oahu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States and his colleague delivered to our Secretary of State a formal reply to a recent American message. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
So there, of course, FDR's remarks before Congress on the 8th of December, 1941. All right. Now, after this attack, Japanese victories are going to take place in a lot of different places. Now, it is worth mentioning, by the way, on the previous slide that almost at the same time Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese were attacking and bombing, or having bombing raids on the British colony of Hong Kong and American-controlled Guam and Wake Island, which we'll also see here. They also landed an invasion force in Thailand, and the Japanese drive for the Pacific Empire is underway. Now, like I said, so we're going to talk about some Japanese victories here. Lightly defended, Guam and Wake Island, which we just talked about them bombing and invading, quickly fell to the Japanese forces. Now, the Japanese then turned their attention to the Philippines. In January 1942, they marched in the Philippine capital of Manila, and American and Filipino forces took up a defensive position on Bataan Peninsula on the northwest edge of Manila Bay. At the same time, the Philippine government moved to the island of Corregidor, just to the south of Bataan. Now, after about 3 months of tough fighting, the Japanese took the Bataan Peninsula in April, and Corregidor fell the following month. The Japanese also continued their strikes against British possessions in Asia, and after seizing Hong Kong, they invaded Malaya from the sea and overland from Thailand. By February 1942, the Japanese had reached Singapore, which was strategically located at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, and after fierce pounding, the colony surrendered. Within a month, the Japanese had conquered the resource-rich Dutch East Indias, which we now call Indonesia, including the islands of Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and Celebes. Now, the Japanese also moved westward, taking Burma. From there, they planned to launch a strike against India, the largest of Great Britain's colonies. By the time Burma fell, Japan had taken control of more than 1 million square miles of Asian land. About 150 million people lived in this vast area, and before these conquests, the Japanese had tried to win the support of the Asians with the anti-colonialist idea of, quote, Asia for the Asiatics. After victory, however, the Japanese nihilist idea... After victory, however, the Japanese quickly made it clear they had come as conquerors. They often treated the people of their new colonies with extreme cruelty, especially those who they took prisoner. The Japanese reserved their most brutal cruelty and treatment for the Allied prisoners of the war. Now, the Japanese considered it generally dishonorable to surrender, and so they had a lot of contempt for prisoners of the war in their charge. One particularly offensive bit of torture was the Bataan Death March. This was a forced march of more than 50 miles up the peninsula, the Japanese subjecting their captives to terrible cruelties on the whole thing. One Allied prisoner from the war, named Lieutenant John Spanhauer, actually says in his war diary this, quote, I was questioned by a Japanese officer who found out that I had been in the Philippine Scout Battalion. The officer and the Japanese in particular hated scouts. Anyway, they took me outside and I was forced to watch as they buried 6 of my scouts alive. They made the men dig their own graves and then had them kneel down in a pit. The guards hit them over the head with shovels to stun them and then piled earth on top. So, obviously a lot of psychological torture here for the people even that they weren't killing, but just great amounts of torture that, you know, today would be well against the Geneva Convention. Many of these people, of course, I'm sure, tried as war criminals after the war if they survived. Of the approximately 70,000 prisoners who started the Bataan Death March, something like only 54,000 or so survived. So you have 16,000 casualties on this death march. All right. Now, Allies strike back. So, after a string of victories, the Japanese obviously kind of seemed unbeatable and invincible. Nonetheless, the Allies, and mainly the Americans and Australians, were anxious to strike back in the Pacific. The Americans mainly because they were just attacked, and the Australians because they live in the Pacific, and if that goes south, obviously they're going to have a problem. Now, the United States in particular wanted revenge for Pearl Harbor, of course. In April 1942, 16 B-25 bombers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle bombed Tokyo and several other Japanese cities. Now, 19 bombers is not a lot, so the bombs did very little damage, which is kind of ironic given the term the Doolittle raid. But the raid, however, made an important psychological point to both Japan and the Americans. One, basically, that Japan was not invincible and was in fact vulnerable to attacks. Alright, let's look at how the Allies turned the tide, the Battle of the Coral Sea, and then we'll look at also the Battle of Midway. Doolittle's raid on Japan raised American morale and shook the confidence of some in Japan. As one Japanese citizen noted, quote, "We started to doubt that we were invincible," close quote. In addition, some Japanese worried that defending and controlling a vast empire had caused them to spread their resources too thin. Slowly, the Allies began to turn the tide of war. In early May of 1942, an American fleet with Australian support, because this is a world history class, of course, intercepted a Japanese strike force headed for Port Moresby in New Guinea. Now, the city housed a critical Allied air base, so obviously them getting there would be a bad thing, and control of the air base would also put Japanese in easy striking distance of Australia, so obviously the Australians have sort of a reason to be here as well. Now, in the battle that followed, the Battle of Coral Sea, both sides used a new kind of naval warfare. In fact, the opening the opposing ships, did not fire a single shot. In fact, they could often not see one another. Instead, airplanes taking off from huge aircraft carriers around these fleets attacked the ships on either side. Now, the Allies suffered more losses in ships and troops than did the Japanese. However, the Battle of Coral Sea is generally seen as something of an Allied victory because it stopped Japan's southward advance, and obviously it keeps them from going to New Guinea like they had really planned. So that's kind of interesting. Now, the Battle of Midway. Midway is much more well known than the Battle of Coral Sea for a couple of reasons, but it is appropriately named, but we'll get to that in a second. Now, Japan next targeted Midway Island, some 1,500 miles west of Hawaii. Midway is the location of a key American airfield, or it was at that time anyway, and thanks to Allied codebreakers, Admiral Chester Nimitz, a commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, knew that a huge Japanese force was heading towards Midway at this point. Now, Admiral Yamamoto, Isoroku Yamamoto, we saw earlier, himself was in command of the Japanese fleet. He had hoped that the attack in Midway would draw the whole of the U.S. fleet from Pearl Harbor to defend the island. Now, on June 4th, the American forces hidden beyond the horizon, Nimitz allowed the Japanese to begin their assault on the island. Now, as the first Japanese planes got into the air, American planes swooped in to attack the Japanese fleet. Many Japanese planes were still on the decks of the aircraft carriers, and the strategy was an immense success. American pilots were able to destroy something like 332 Japanese planes, all 4 aircraft carriers that were there, and 1 support ship. Yamamoto, of course, because of this, ordered his crippled fleet to withdraw. By June 7, 1942, the battle was over. The Battle of Midway turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. Again, it is properly named as an island, one, because it is literally in the middle of the Pacific, and it may be a little hard to tell on this map, but you have the United States over here, you have China on the left side. Midway is essentially directly in the middle of these, and it's also importantly and well named because it's kind of the midpoint of the war, or the point at which the war kind of turns in the Allies' favor in the Pacific anyway. Now, the Battle of Midway is also one of your vocab terms, and it is a 1942 sea and air battle of World War II in which the American forces defeated the Japanese forces in the central Pacific Ocean, specifically at Midway, but we're not putting the word Midway in the definition there. So, there you are. Now, an Allied offensive, island hopping. With morale high after the victory at Midway, the Allies took the offensive. The war in the Pacific involved vast distances. Of course, because they're in an ocean. The Japanese troops had dug in on hundreds of islands across the ocean, and General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of the Allied land forces in the Pacific, developed a plan to handle this problem. MacArthur believed that storming each island would be a long, costly effort that would cost many American lives, many Japanese lives, obviously, but it's something that would really just be fairly difficult in general. He instead, what he wanted to do was called island hopping. He was going to jump or hop, so to speak, past Japanese strongholds, and he would then seize islands that were not well defended but were closer to Japan. Keep in mind here that Douglas MacArthur is one of your vocab terms, and he is, quote, the American 5-star general who played a prominent role in the Pacific theater of World War II and came up with the idea of island hopping, which was very helpful to us here. Now, MacArthur's first target for this island hopping campaign soon presented itself. The U.S. military leaders had learned that the Japanese were building a huge Air Force base on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Now, the Allies had to strike fast before the base was completed and became another Japanese stronghold. At dawn on August 7th, 1942, several thousand U.S. Marines with Australian support landed on Guadalcanal and the neighboring island of Tulagi. Now, the Marines had little trouble seizing Guadalcanal's airfield. That part was pretty easy. However, the battle for control of the rest of the island turned into a savage struggle as both sides poured in thousands of fresh troops. In February 1943, after 6 months of fighting on land and on sea, the Battle of Guadalcanal finally ended. After losing more than 24,000 men of its 36,000 soldier force, the Japanese abandoned the island and came to call it the Island of Death. Of course, fighting was fierce on both sides. The Americans didn't like it either. One particular American, a war correspondent named Ralph Martin, the U.S. Who was with the U.S. soldiers who fought there, said that Guadalcanal was simply hell. He says in the GI War, this is one of his books, he says, "Hell was a red furry spider as big as your fist, enormous rats and bats everywhere, and rivers with wading crocodiles. Hell was the sour, foul smell of the squishy jungle, humidity that rotted bodies within hours. Hell was an enemy so fantastic that it would use its own dead as booby traps." So obviously they're not real fond of it either. Now, by the way, fun fact, my grandfather, Ray Price Hook, was in Guadalcanal. He was an assistant chaplain, so it is questionable to exactly how much fighting that he really saw, but he was there. So a lot of us have personal connections to World War II soldiers. Obviously, in this case, I have my grandfather, actually my maternal grandfather in this case. My paternal grandfather was actually in Europe as an engineer. But anyway, the Guadalcanal, the Battle of Guadalcanal is one of your vocab terms. It is the 1942-43 Battle of World War II in which the Allied troops drove the Japanese forces from the Pacific island of Guadalcanal. Alright, now, we'll see in Section 3 that as Japan worked to establish new order in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the Nazis are going to move ahead with Hitler's design for a new order in Europe. This design, of course, includes plans for dealing with those who Hitler considered unfit for the Third Reich. You will learn about these plans, of course, in our next section, which means we're going to talk about the Holocaust. Yep. Alright, see you then. Bye. Thanks for listening.